My name is Judith Hedrick. I'm 42 years old. Last Christmas, my sister Cynthia hosted dinner at my grandmother's house. She set a beautiful table, crystal glasses, cloth napkins, lobster mac and cheese for her children. Then she walked to where my son and daughter were sitting, looked down at them, and placed 1 cup of water in front of each of them. Not a plate, not a fork, 2 cups of water. She walked away like that was the end of it. My grandmother Regina was sitting at the head of the table. She saw everything, and she had been waiting, longer than any of us knew, for exactly this moment. I want to tell you how we got there, because that table didn't happen by accident. Nothing in my family ever does. There are 6 family photos on my mother's living room wall. I am in 2 of them. Both were taken before Cynthia got married. The other 4, the ones in the larger frames, the ones with the better light, were taken at Christmases and birthday parties, and the kind of Sunday dinners that get photographed because someone decided the moment was worth preserving. I am not in those 4. Not because I wasn't present. I was there every time. I just wasn't in the frame. That is the most precise way I know how to describe what it felt like to be Cynthia's younger sister for the past 20 years. Not absent, never fully absent, just consistently outside the frame. Cynthia is 44. She married a man named Todd Barwell when she was 26, and in the years that followed she developed a particular talent, the talent of making her life appear to be the only life in the room that fully counted. Todd owns a contracting business. Cynthia does not work outside the home. They have 2 children, Preston, who is 13, and Sloan, who is 10. They live in a newer development on the east side of town, the kind of neighborhood with a homeowners association and a newsletter about gutter cleaning and a Facebook group where people post about coyote sightings. From the outside, it looks exactly like the life our mother always imagined one of her daughters would have. My mother's name is Laura. She is 65 years old. She has been a widow for 7 years, and in the absence of my father, she restructured her emotional world around proximity. Not physical proximity, but informational proximity. Around whoever called first. Around whoever shaped the story before the other version could arrive. That person was almost always Cynthia. I want to be fair about my mother. She is not a cruel woman. She never intended to disappear me from her own family's narrative. But intention and impact are different things, and for a long time I confused them, which made everything harder to name than it needed to be. Once I stopped confusing them, I couldn't unname what I saw. My name is Judith. I have been a commercial real estate agent for 12 years. I was married for 9 years to a man I will not spend much time describing here, because he is not the point of this story. We divorced 5 years ago. The divorce was not clean. It did not need to be particularly dirty either. But his attorney made choices that extended things, and I spent about 14 months navigating a legal process while also working full-time and raising 2 children who needed a mother who was present and not visibly falling apart. I mostly managed the last part. Mostly. My son Wesley is 11 years old. He reads in the car on the way to everywhere, in the back seat, with whatever book he's currently in the middle of, using the overhead light on cloudy days, even when I ask him not to because it bothers my eyes in the rearview mirror. My daughter Anna is 8. She draws on everything available, the backs of envelopes, paper bags, the margins of school worksheets, the inside covers of books that technically belong to the public library. She has a particular talent for drawing faces, which she has had since she was about 4 years old, and which still surprises me sometimes when I look at what she's made. They are patient children. They learn patience early. I wish they hadn't had to. 14 months ago, I married a man named Neil. He is a structural engineer. He is not a big talker at family gatherings. He tends to find a position in the room that lets him see most of it, and then he stays there, quietly, and watches. He is very good at this. The first family dinner he attended with my family, he sat beside me at the table and said nothing consequential all evening. On the drive home he said, "Your sister acts like she owns the place." Not a question, just an observation, delivered in the same tone he uses to read aloud from menus. I looked at him. I said, "You have no idea how right you are." He looked back at me for a moment and then turned toward the road. He did not ask me to explain. He filed it away, accurately, completely, and did not forget. In the back seat of our car that night, Wesley had his book open in the dark, tilting it toward the window to catch the streetlights. Anna had fallen asleep with her coat still on. I remember thinking, on that particular drive home, that I was very tired of carrying things I couldn't yet put down. That was 3 Christmases ago. A great deal has changed. The house where Cynthia hosts Christmas is located at 412 Crescent Mill Drive. It is a 4-bedroom house in a quiet part of town, with a deep front porch and a backyard that has 2 oak trees and a garden that my grandmother keeps in better shape than most people half her age. On paper, on county records, on the name printed at the top of the mortgage statement, this house belongs to my grandmother Regina. That is what my mother believes. That is what Cynthia believes. That is what Todd believes. It is what my aunt and uncle believe, what the neighbors believe, what the woman from my grandmother's church who comes for Thanksgiving every year believes. It is not what is true. To explain what is true, I need to go back 5 years. My divorce was legally finalized in the spring of 2020, but the complicated part began. Roughly 14 months before that, when my then-husband's attorney filed a motion disputing the classification of certain assets. One of those assets was a property I had purchased, 412 Crescent Mill Drive, using money I had saved before our marriage. The money was documented. The timeline was documented. But documentation does not prevent a protracted legal argument, and a protracted legal argument was exactly what I was facing. I needed to protect the property. Not through anything dishonest. The money was mine, the purchase was mine, the timeline was clear, but through something structural, something that would take the house out of the dispute while the dispute was ongoing. I needed to put it in someone else's name temporarily, cleanly, and with someone I trusted so completely that the word trust feels slightly too small for what I mean. My grandmother's name is Regina. She is 84 years old. She spent 35 years working as a legal secretary, 35 years of watching attorneys draft documents, file motions, make arguments, and occasionally make errors that cost their clients enormously. She knows what paperwork means. She knows what it costs to get it wrong. She knows which errors are recoverable and which ones aren't. When I came to her with the problem, she listened to the entire thing without interrupting. Then she said, "Put it in my name, temporary arrangement. We do it correctly, with proper documentation, and we keep copies of everything. I know exactly which forms need to be filed." We went to the notary on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2020. The notary's name was Gerald Whitfield. He was a slow, methodical man who checked every line twice before moving to the next one, which I appreciated. My grandmother wore her blue cardigan, the one she wears when she considers a day to be important. I wore a brown wool coat I've since given away. There were 2 complete copies of every document. One set was filed with the county. The other set went into a wooden box, dark wood, not large, with a small brass lock, that my grandmother placed in her bedroom closet. She took the key from a dish on her dresser, threaded it onto a thin gold chain, and clasped it around her neck. Not as a symbol, as a system. Before we left Gerald's office, she took my arm and said, "This stays between us until it needs to not stay between us." I said, "I understand." She looked at me for a moment with the expression she uses when she wants to confirm that the person she's talking to actually understands and is not simply agreeing. Then she nodded. I did understand, more completely, I would later realize, than even I knew at the time. The mortgage on 412 Crescent Mill Drive was $1,940 a month. I paid it every single month for 5 years by transferring money into my grandmother's account on the first of each month, from which she wrote the check directly to the bank. $1,940, first of the month, for 60 months. $116,400 paid into a house that appeared, to every member of my family who had any opinion about it, to belong to an 84-year-old woman who lived alone and needed looking after. In 2021, Cynthia decided she would start looking after her. She announced this to my mother as an act of generosity. She said, "Now that Grandma's getting older, someone should be more present. Someone should be making sure the house is kept up and the gatherings are organized." My mother agreed that this was thoughtful. I was not part of that conversation. I found out about it afterward, when my mother mentioned it in passing, in the way she mentioned many things, as established fact, as something already agreed upon, not as something that required my input. Cynthia hosted her first Christmas at 412 Crescent Mill Drive in December of 2021. She brought the decorations, she selected the menu, she put her favorite serving dishes on the counter, and her playlists on the Bluetooth speaker in the kitchen and her children's stockings on the mantel. She told my mother she'd handle the invitations. When I received mine, a text message, 3 days before the event, it said, "Christmas dinner at Grandma's, 6 o'clock, bring something if you want." I brought a casserole. I sat where there was space. I said nothing about the stockings on the mantel, which did not include ones for Wesley and Anna. I went to the second Christmas and said nothing. I went to the third. I told myself each time that the problem was small, that I was choosing my battles, that it wasn't worth the disruption. And each time I was wrong. Not about whether to speak, perhaps, but about what my silence was communicating to the people around me. My silence was being read as consent, as acceptance, as confirmation that the arrangement was fine with everyone. It was not fine. But by the time I understood how unfine it was, the pattern had been running long enough that disrupting it would itself be framed as the problem. That is how these things work. That is how they are designed to work. Let me give you 3 specific moments so you understand what I mean when I say pattern. Christmas of 2022. Wesley was 9. He had found his preferred chair early in the evening, the one near the window, with the good reading light coming in from the porch, the chair he had gravitated toward at every family gathering since he was old enough to choose for himself. He had a book with him. He was happy. About 45 minutes into the evening, Cynthia came over and said, pleasantly, efficiently, in the voice she uses when she is managing a situation rather than asking a question, that she needed that chair for Sloane's friend, who had just arrived and needed somewhere to sit. Wesley got up. He found a chair in the corner near the buffet table, where the light was poor and people kept stepping around him to reach the serving spoons. He sat there for the rest of the evening without complaining. He was 9 years old, and he had already learned not to complain. I watched this happen in less time than it takes to cross a room. By the time I could have said anything, it was done. And if I had said something, if I had made an issue of a chair, I would have been the one making the evening difficult. That is the mechanism. That is how it functions. The action happens faster than the objection can form, and the objection, when it finally arrives, looks disproportionate to the completed act. Thanksgiving of 2023. My aunt and uncle were visiting from out of state, my father's sister and her husband, who came perhaps once a year and who genuinely wanted to know how everyone was doing. Cynthia went around the table making introductions. She was good at this, warm, fluid, giving each person a small descriptor that made them sound interesting. She said Preston was doing great in school. She said Sloane had just started soccer. She mentioned Todd's parents and my mother and my grandmother. She did not say Anna's name. Anna was sitting at the table, 6 years old, holding a dinner roll she hadn't eaten yet, wearing a sweater with a small embroidered star on the front that she had chosen herself that morning because she wanted to look nice. My aunt noticed her afterward and asked what her name was. Anna said, "I'm Anna." My aunt said, "Of course you are. What a pretty sweater." Cynthia had already moved on to a conversation about the sweet potato casserole. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A 6-year-old child at a family dinner, not introduced by name, not overlooked in the chaos. Cynthia was organized, deliberate, going around the table specifically to make introductions. Anna was sitting right there. She simply wasn't included. And because it happened in the middle of a warm and busy table, it was the kind of thing that, if you mentioned it later, could be explained away as an oversight. A simple oversight. These things happen at big dinners. Except this was the 3rd year in a row. Summer of 2024. I drove to 412 Crescent Mill Drive on a Tuesday afternoon because my grandmother had mentioned her knee was bothering her and I was bringing soup. Chicken and rice, her preference, made that morning. Cynthia was there when I arrived. She had 2 women with her, neighbors from her own street apparently, who had become regulars at my grandmother's house over the past year. I didn't know them. They were sitting in the living room with glasses of iced tea. When I came through the door with the soup container, Cynthia looked up and said, in her pleasant and efficient voice, "Oh, Judy just dropped something off. Not, this is my sister. Not, come in, sit down, not even an introduction. Just, Judy just dropped something off. The way you describe a delivery, the way you categorize a person into a function so that the people in the room understand their role and don't need to engage further." I set the soup on the kitchen counter. I said goodbye to my grandmother on my way out. She was in her chair by the window. She held my hand for a moment at the door, held it a beat longer than necessary, with both of hers wrapped around mine, and looked at me with an expression that said many things without saying any of them. Judy just dropped something off, at a house I owned, with money I had paid, with my name on the deed in a folder inside a locked wooden box, 30 feet from where Cynthia was handing out iced tea to her neighbors. Each time one of these moments happened, I told myself it was small, and each time the smallness was part of the design. Because small things, repeated with consistency, in front of the same witnesses without correction, are not small. They are instructions. They tell everyone present what the social order is and who holds the authority to enforce it. What Cynthia was doing was not the product of rudeness or carelessness or a bad day. It was a system, subtle enough to be deniable, consistent enough to be structural. The other half of the system was my mother. I don't say this to blame her. I say it because it's accurate and because the accuracy matters. After every incident, every displaced chair, every omitted name, every managed exit, Cynthia called our mother first. I know this because my mother would sometimes, without realizing it, reference those calls in conversation. She would say things like, "Cynthia mentioned you've been having a hard time lately," or "I heard things were a little tense at Thanksgiving, but I think everyone was just stressed." The story always arrived before I did. By the time I said anything, if I said anything, it had already been categorized, and the category was always some variation of Judy being a little sensitive about things. I am not a sensitive person. I am a precise one. There is a significant difference between those two things, and for a long time my family confused them, which benefited exactly one person in that family. I understood all of this with increasing clarity over the years. What I did not have, until 2 weeks before Christmas of 2025, was the specific piece of information that made the entire picture finally irreversibly clear. I found it on a Tuesday. I came to my grandmother's house the way I always came, with 2 coffees, both black, no sugar, from the place on the corner of 5th that she prefers, because they don't over-roast. She was at the kitchen table when I arrived, reading. We sat together for a while. She was quieter than usual, not uncomfortable quiet, the kind of quiet that has a shape to it, the kind that means someone is waiting for something specific. After a while, she mentioned that she'd been having trouble with her email, something about a delivery notification she couldn't find. She asked if I could look. I opened her laptop. The browser went to her inbox. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't expecting anything. But the subject line was visible in the preview panel before I could look away. Listing timeline for Barwell property, 412 Crescent Mill Drive. I read it once, I read it again, then I opened it. Todd had contacted a real estate agent named Susan Carver 6 weeks earlier. The email chain was detailed. They had discussed comparable sales in the surrounding area, anticipated market conditions for the first quarter of the coming year, and what Susan described as an optimal listing window. Todd had written, in his own words, that they were looking at listing after the current occupant vacates. In a follow-up message, Susan had provided a market valuation, $520,000 to $540,000, depending on condition at time of listing, after the current occupant vacates. My grandmother was 84 years old. Todd was already scheduling around her death. I closed the laptop. I sat very still. Then I looked at my grandmother. She was already looking at me. She had been looking at me since I opened the email. She had known it was there. She had left it there for me to find. She told me then, quietly, in the way she tells me things she has already fully processed, that she had received the same email chain 3 weeks before that Tuesday, forwarded by Susan Carver, who had searched the county records for the property owner and sent the correspondence to the email address on file. The name on file was my grandmother's. Susan had assumed reasonably that she was communicating with the owner. My grandmother had read every email in that chain. She had not replied. Instead, she had called Robert Gaines, an attorney she had worked with for nearly 2 decades when she was still in the law office, and who had handled a few personal matters for her since, and asked him a single question. She told me what the question was. If someone attempts to arrange the sale of a property to which they hold no legal title, what are their potential liabilities? Robert Gaines had answered her question in full. My grandmother had thanked him, ended the call, and then she had waited. She had waited 3 weeks. She had waited for me to come on Tuesday. She had wanted me to find the email myself. She had wanted me to be in the room when I found it, so that I would be ready, and so that we could decide together what came next. I looked at her across the kitchen table and I said, "You've known for 3 weeks." She said, "I knew you'd come Tuesday." I said, "And you didn't call me." She said, "I needed you to find it here, not over the phone. Here." I drove home that afternoon and I did not contact Cynthia. I did not contact Todd. I did not call my mother. I called Carol Whitmore, who is my attorney and who handles real estate transactions, and I told her what I had found. I asked her to prepare a complete documentation package. Deed, transfer papers from 2020, the mortgage agreement, 60 months of payment records, the notarized certification from Gerald Whitfield. Everything in sequence, everything complete. She said she would have it ready within the week. Neil was home when I arrived. He looked at my face when I walked in and said, "What happened?" Not a question. I told him everything, standing in the kitchen with my coat still on. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you want to address this before Christmas or at Christmas?" I said, "My grandmother has already decided." He nodded. He walked to the office. He came back 8 minutes later holding a folder, dark navy blue, the kind he uses for project files, and he put it on the table in front of me. He said, "I printed the payment history last month, all 60 months, organized by date." I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at him. He said, "I had a feeling we might need it at some point. I just didn't know when. That is the man I married. Someone who notices things, prepares for them quietly, and does not make a performance of being right." I spent the next 2 weeks in a particular kind of stillness. I went to work. I helped Wesley with a history project about the Louisiana Purchase. I took Anna to her Saturday art class and sat in the waiting area reading a magazine I did not absorb. I paid the December mortgage on 412 Crescent Mill Drive on the 1st of the month, from the same account I had always used, to the same bank, in the same amount, $1,940, 1st of the month, as always. Cynthia texted me the week before Christmas about the dinner. She said, "Same as usual, 6 o'clock, you can bring the green bean thing if you want." I said I would. I didn't say anything else. The night before Christmas, my grandmother called me. It was late, close to 11. She never goes to bed before midnight, a habit she's had her entire life and shows no sign of changing. She asked if I was ready. I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Wear something good tomorrow." "Not for them, for you," I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in 2 weeks. I hadn't realized until that moment how much I needed to. She said one more thing before we hung up. She said, "I need you to stay calm no matter what Cynthia says, no matter what Todd says. Can you do that?" I told her I had been practicing for 20 years. She said, "Good, then get some sleep." The next evening, we pulled into the driveway of 412 Crescent Mill Drive just after dusk. Cynthia had strung white lights along the gutters and wound them through the boxwood hedges at the front of the property. Small bulbs, evenly spaced, the tasteful kind, because Cynthia was always tasteful about appearances. The porch light was on. Through the front window, I could see the warm yellow of the interior lights and the silhouette of what looked like a large centerpiece on the dining room table. Neil parked. He reached into the back seat for the casserole dish. The navy folder was there too, tucked against the seat back where we'd left it that morning. He looked at it. I said, "We'll see." He picked up the casserole dish and we got out of the car. A neighbor was coming up the sidewalk with a dog on a leash. Cynthia was at the open front door. She had positioned herself there, I noticed, in the way you position yourself when you want to be seen welcoming people into a space. She waved at the neighbor and called, "Come by later if you want some dessert, we always have extra." The neighbor waved back. I noticed the word "always," as though this were an established tradition, as though this were her standing offer, at her home, to her neighbors. Inside, the table was set for 12. Cynthia had used the good china, the white set with the thin gold rim, the one that had been in the cabinet since before I was born, the one that came out only for occasions someone had decided were worth the good china. Crystal glasses at every setting, cloth napkins folded into neat triangles, small handwritten name cards placed above each plate. The flowers in the center were white and red, arranged in a low vase that sat at exactly the height that lets guests see each other across the table. Cynthia understood these things. She had an eye for arrangement. I looked for our name cards. Wesley, Anna, Neil, and I were placed at the far end of the table, nearest the door to the kitchen, the end where the traffic from the kitchen would pass, where you could hear the refrigerator opening, where the overhead light was slightly dimmer than over the rest of the table. There were no handwritten name cards at our end, just 4 chairs grouped together with paper napkins set flat and unfolded on the seats. I noticed. I adjusted the paper napkins into a slightly neater arrangement. I sat down. I said nothing. Preston and Sloane had the seats closest to the head of the table, the position of preference, the location that my grandmother's chair anchors, and that Cynthia had established as the warm center of the gathering. Preston was already eating something small from a dish. Sloane was showing him something on her phone. They didn't look up when we came in. My grandmother was not yet at the table. I could hear her in the kitchen with my mother. 2 voices, low and comfortable, the particular frequency of women who have known each other a very long time. Cynthia came out of the kitchen when she heard us. She smiled. She said, "You made it. Great." She gestured toward our end of the table in a broad, efficient sweep, the gesture of someone directing traffic rather than welcoming guests, and she moved on toward another cluster of people near the window. Neil set the casserole dish on the sideboard. He found our seats. Wesley sat down and put his book on his lap, under the table where he keeps it in reserve. Anna sat beside me and straightened the paper napkin in front of her, the way I straighten things when I'm waiting for something to resolve. Dinner was served in stages. The first course to be distributed was the children's plates. Cynthia had ordered from a catering company individual ramekins of lobster mac and cheese, with a breadcrumb crust that had browned to an even amber, the kind of dish that announces itself before it arrives. Preston and Sloane each received one, delivered by Cynthia herself with the ceremony of someone presenting something they are proud of. The smell was extraordinary, butter and cream and the faint brine of lobster, and it reached our end of the table before anything else did. Wesley looked at the ramekins. He looked at me. I shook my head very slightly. He looked back at the table. Nothing came to our end. The adult course arrived next. A large pasta dish placed in the center of the table, served with a ladle. Cynthia went around with the serving spoon. My grandmother first, then my mother, then Todd's parents, then the neighbor Francis who came every year and sat near the window, then the couple from Cynthia and Todd's neighborhood, who I recognized vaguely from previous years. She came to our end of the table. She looked at the 4 of us, and then she set the serving dish down on the trivet near the center of the table, and she said, in her pleasant and caring voice, "Oh, your kids can eat later, at home." There wasn't quite enough of the lobster for everyone. She said it the way you say something when you have already categorized it as a non-issue. Clean, light, decisive, moving on. She turned and went back toward the kitchen. A minute later she returned. She was carrying 2 cups, plastic cups, the disposable kind with the small rolled lip, the kind that comes in a package of 50 from the grocery store. She walked to where Wesley and Anna were sitting. She set 1 cup down in front of Wesley. Then she set 1 cup down in front of Anna. She said, "There's water in the pitcher if they need more." And then she moved on, the way she always moved on. The way a person moves on from something they have decided requires nothing further. The crystal glasses were still at every other place at the table. Anna looked at the cup in front of her. It was a small cup. It had a slight warp on one side where something had pressed against the packaging. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at me. She didn't say a word. She was 8 years old, and she had learned, in the way children learn these things in families like ours, that there are moments when speaking only makes things worse. She folded her hands in her lap. She sat very still and waited. I put my hand over hers. I said quietly, close to her ear, "Give it a few minutes, sweetheart." I was not talking about dinner. She was old enough, I think, to understand that. My mother was 3 seats away. I saw her face when Cynthia put those cups down. I watched something move across it. Not outrage, not yet, but the flinch of a woman who has just registered something she cannot immediately explain away. She looked at Cynthia. She said in a voice that was not loud, but was very clear, "Cynthia, feed them first next time." Cynthia looked at her. The managing smile returned. She said, "Mom, there's plenty of other things on the table. The kids will be fine." And she turned away. At the head of the table, my grandmother had not moved. She was sitting with her hands folded on the tablecloth, watching. Not watching in the restless way of someone looking for an opportunity. Watching in the patient way of someone who has already decided and is simply waiting for the internal clock she set a long time ago to reach its appointed time. I had seen that exact expression on her face once before. In Gerald Whitfield's office, in March of 2020, right before she signed her name to the transfer documents. It was the expression of a woman who has made a decision, completed her preparation, and is now simply present for what follows. She pushed her chair back from the table. She said quietly, "Excuse me, I need to get something from my room." Her voice was ordinary, domestic. The voice of someone who has forgotten a sweater or remembers they left a gift unwrapped. Todd looked up for perhaps half a second and then went back to whatever he was saying. Cynthia didn't look up at all. My mother watched my grandmother go, with a look I couldn't fully read, somewhere between concern and curiosity, the look of a woman who has lived long enough to know when something is more than it appears. Neil, sitting beside me, did not move or speak, but under the table, his hand found my forearm. He gave it one brief, deliberate press. Then he let go and reached back for his water glass like nothing had happened. She was gone for perhaps 2 minutes. When she came back, she was carrying the wooden box. She walked to the head of the table and set it down beside her plate. Not loudly, not dramatically. She simply placed it where she wanted it and sat back down in her chair. The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent the way a room does when something enters that nobody can immediately categorize. A gradual, spreading quiet, like sound being slowly turned down. Preston looked up from his ramekin. Sloane stopped mid-sentence. Todd's mother set down her glass. The neighbor Frances, who had been describing something about her garden, let the sentence trail off unfinished. Cynthia said, "Mom, what is that?" My grandmother placed both hands flat on top of the box. She looked around the table, slowly, from one face to the next, not hurrying. The way you look at people when you want them to understand that you have been watching for a long time and have not missed anything. Then she reached up to the collar of her dress and unclasped the thin gold chain. The small key caught the light from the overhead chandelier as she laid it on the tablecloth beside the box. Cynthia said, "What are you doing?" My grandmother said, "Sit down, Cynthia." Cynthia was already seated. But she stopped speaking, which I understood was what my grandmother meant. What happened over the next several minutes was not dramatic in the way we usually mean when we call something dramatic. There was no raised voice. There was no swept-aside dishes or theatrical gesture. There was only my grandmother sitting at the head of her table, speaking in the measured and unhurried cadence of a woman who has said important things in formal contexts before and understands the weight that silence carries when placed correctly. She looked at Todd first. She said, "You sent a series of emails to a real estate agent regarding this property." Todd opened his mouth. He said, "We were just looking into some." She raised one hand. Just slightly, he stopped. She said, "I am not finished." She looked at Cynthia. She said, "You have hosted Christmas in this house for 4 years. You have introduced yourself to the neighbors as the person who manages things here. You have presented yourself as the one who looks after me and this home." She paused. She said, "I have watched you do all of this. I have said nothing until tonight." Cynthia said, "Mom, I think," my grandmother said, "I said I'm not finished." The table was very quiet now. Even Preston and Sloane had gone still. My grandmother picked up the small key. She fit it into the lock of the wooden box. She turned it. She opened the lid. Inside was a folder, dark green, thick, with plastic tabs along the side, color-coded, the tabs labeled in her precise handwriting: deed of transfer, mortgage agreement, payment records, notarization. She had assembled this before Christmas. She had organized it with the care of a woman who spent 35 years making sure documents were in order before they needed to be used. She removed the folder from the box. She laid it on the table. Then she opened it and began placing the documents down, one at a time, in sequence, not quickly. One document, a pause. The next document, a pause. Each one given a moment to be visible before the next arrived. The deed of transfer, the mortgage agreement, the first page of the payment history, 60 rows of dates and amounts and confirmation numbers. The notarized certification with Gerald Whitfield's seal in the lower right corner. Todd leaned forward when she set down the deed. He read it from where he was sitting. He read it once, then he read it again. His face did a specific thing, a kind of rapid recalibration, a visible adjustment of something he had believed to be fixed. And then he looked at me. My grandmother read the deed aloud. She said, 412 Crescent Mill Drive, Owner of record, Judith Ann Hedrick. Date of transfer, March 14th, 2020. Notarized by Gerald B. Whitfield, Notary Public. She said my full name aloud, in that room, in that house, and something in me that had been sitting slightly out of its correct position for 5 years quietly moved back into place. Cynthia said, "That can't be right." My grandmother said, "I was present when it was signed. I proposed the arrangement. I held the pen she used to initial each page." Cynthia looked at me. Her face was doing something I had never seen it do, cycling through several expressions at once without landing on any of them. Finally, she said, "You set this up. You planned this whole thing." I said, "No, I bought a house. You set this up." There was a silence after that sentence. A complete one. My grandmother turned to Todd. She reached to the side of the folder and removed a sheet of paper that had been clipped separately from the rest. The email chain, printed on 3 pages, the correspondence between Todd and Susan Carver. She placed it on the table beside the deed. She said, "You contacted a real estate agent to discuss the sale of a property to which you hold no legal title. You planned this without the knowledge or consent of the owner." Todd said, "I didn't know who." She said, "You had the address. You had it in writing. You sent it in a correspondence to a licensed agent. You knew the address and you chose not to make any inquiry about who held the title." She looked at him for a moment, not with anger, with the particular precision of a woman who has spent decades watching what happens when people choose not to ask questions they know they should be asking. Then she looked at Neil. Neil reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He removed the navy folder. He slid it across the table, past the glasses and the serving dishes and the cloth napkins, until it came to rest in front of Todd. He said quietly, 60 months of mortgage payments. In case the math is useful, Todd looked at the folder. He placed his hand on top of it but did not open it. He looked the way people look when they understand that a thing has become evidence. Cynthia stood up. Her chair scraped back against the hardwood. She looked at my mother. My mother did not look back at her. This was the thing I had not anticipated. Not the folder, not the deed, not even my grandmother reading my name aloud in my own house. What I had not expected was my mother, sitting 3 seats away, hands flat on the tablecloth, looking down at the documents spread across the surface and simply not turning toward Cynthia. It lasted only a few seconds, but Cynthia felt it. I could see it on her face. The recognition that something had shifted in a direction she did not control and could not immediately manage. Her eyes went to my mother's profile. My mother continued to look down at the table. Then my mother looked up. She looked at me. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was just clear. She said, "Judith, I didn't know." 3 words, simple ones, but they carried 20 years of things inside them. 20 years of being handed one version of events and accepting it. 20 years of being positioned between her 2 daughters in a way that was never actually neutral. I said, "I know, Mom," because I did know. I had always known that my mother was not cruel. She was a woman who had been given consistent information from a consistent source for a long time, and who had not had reason, or not enough reason, to question it. That is not the same as choosing it, but it is also not the same as innocence. What mattered in that moment was not the accounting. What mattered was that she was looking at me, directly, without the filter of Cynthia's version of things between us. Frances, the neighbor from my grandmother's church who came every year and sat near the window, had folded her hands in her lap and was looking at the tablecloth. Todd's parents had gone very still. The couple from Cynthia's neighborhood were exchanging a look with each other that suggested they were trying to determine the least complicated moment to say goodnight. Preston, who is 13 and intelligent, was sitting with his fork held in one hand, not eating, understanding that something significant had occurred even without understanding the specifics of it. Sloane was looking at her mother with an expression I recognized. The expression of a child watching a parent in a moment the parent did not plan for. Cynthia tried twice more. She said that my grandmother was perhaps confused about certain details. My grandmother looked at her and said, "I am not confused." She said that the arrangement had always been understood by her as temporary and informal. My grandmother said, "It was temporary." The documentation was not informal. She said this was not the appropriate time or setting for this kind of discussion. My grandmother said, "You chose the time, you chose the table, you set every place at it. That last sentence arrived in the room and stayed there. Cynthia sat back down. She did not speak again that evening. Not substantively, not about any of this. She sat in her chair for the remainder of the dinner, with the careful composure of a person holding themselves together through concentration alone. Dinner continued. It was quiet in a new way, not the companionable quiet of a family eating together, but the specific quiet of a room full of people who are processing something privately while maintaining the surface form of an occasion. My grandmother served herself more pasta and asked Frances about her grandchildren. Frances, grateful for the return to ordinary conversation, talked about them for several minutes. My grandmother listened with genuine interest. Anna ate dinner, real dinner, on a white plate with a gold rim, with a cloth napkin in her lap. She didn't make anything of it. She ate carefully and quietly, and at some point toward the end of the meal, she looked across the table at the empty ramekins where Preston and Sloane's lobster had been, and then she looked back at her plate, and then she looked at me with an expression that was not triumph and not satisfaction, but something quieter than both, a kind of awareness of a child who has understood something true about the room she is sitting in. I made a note to talk with her about it later, when we were home, when I could find the right words for what she had witnessed and what it meant and what I wanted her to carry from it. Wesley, beside her, had finished his dinner and retrieved his book from under the table and was reading it in a way that suggested he had decided the rest of the evening was resolved. I watched my grandmother at the head of the table. She was eating her pasta and talking to Frances, and occasionally looking around the room with the steady, unhurried gaze of a woman who has done what she came to do and is now simply present. She caught my eye once during the meal. She didn't smile. She gave a very small, very deliberate nod. That was all. We drove home around 9. Anna fell asleep in the back seat before we reached the main road. Wesley read in the dark, holding his book at an angle to catch the light from passing street lamps. Neil drove. Nobody spoke for most of the drive. Somewhere on the highway, with the heater running and the radio off, he reached over and put his hand on mine for a moment, then he put it back on the wheel. I gave Anna her bath when we got home. I sat on the edge of Wesley's bed for a few minutes while he finished a chapter. He turned off his light and I stood up to go, and he said, from the dark, "Mom." I said, "Yeah." He said, "She knew the whole time, didn't she?" "Great-grandma." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I thought so." And then he rolled over and went to sleep. Neil made tea. We sat at the kitchen table, both of us with our hands around our mugs, and we didn't say much. The house was warm. The clock on the microwave said 10:41. I felt something I had not been expecting. Not victory exactly, not relief precisely, more like a particular stillness. The stillness of a room where a window has been opened for the first time in years, and the air inside is finally starting to change. My phone lit up at 11:43, a text from my mother. It said, "Are the kids okay?" I looked at those 3 words for a long time. She was asking because she had watched Cynthia place plastic cups in front of Wesley and Anna at a table full of crystal glasses, and she had seen it clearly, perhaps for the first time. Seen it not as a small thing, not as a logistical oversight, not as Judy being a little sensitive about things, but as what it actually was. That is not a small shift. 20 years of a consistent narrative does not change in an evening without something real happening inside the person who held it. I typed back, "They're good, Mom. They're asleep." A pause. Then, "Good, I'm glad." Then after another pause, "Can I come by this week?" I said yes. The next morning, Todd called my number. I let it go to voicemail. I have not listened to that voicemail. It is still there in my phone, sitting in the queue below a reminder about Wesley's orthodontist appointment. I have no particular interest in what it contains. I already know the shape of it. My attorney, Carol Whitmore, sent a formal letter to Susan Carver's real estate office on December 23rd. The letter was brief and precisely worded. The property at 412 Crescent Mill Drive had not been listed by its legal owner. The listing agreement signed by Todd Barwell carried no legal standing. All further inquiries regarding the sale of this property should be directed to Carol's office. Susan Carver withdrew the listing agreement within the same business day. She sent a brief email of apology to the address on file, my grandmother's address, which my grandmother read aloud to me on the phone that afternoon in her dry, even voice, with a quiet satisfaction I will not forget. On December 23rd, a copy of Carol Whitmore's letter was delivered to Todd Barwell. Not a lawsuit, not a threat of criminal proceedings, just a document that made clear, with the particular clarity that legal documents carry, who owned what and what the consequences of any further action would be. He made no further contact about the property. On December 26, 2025, the listing for 412 Crescent Mill Drive was officially canceled in Susan Carver's system. There was no sale, there was no transition, there was the house and the name on the deed, and a family that was, slowly, imperfectly, with the kind of difficulty that real things always carry, beginning to be arranged correctly. My mother came by on the 27th. She brought a small potted rosemary plant shaped like a Christmas tree, the kind they sell at grocery stores in December for a few dollars. She stood on my front porch holding it with both hands, and she looked at me and she said, "I'm sorry, Judy. I think I missed things I should have seen. I think I let myself be told a version that was easier to believe than what was actually happening." I opened the door. I said, "Come in, Mom, we have leftovers." She came in. Anna was at the kitchen table drawing. She was working on a series of small illustrated scenes she described to me as a graphic novel in progress, though she was not yet entirely sure what it was about. My mother sat down across from her without being asked and watched for a few minutes and then asked if she could see. Anna showed her without hesitation. They sat together at the table for a long time, Anna explaining each panel, my mother asking questions, both of them bent over the pages in the particular companionable way of people who have found something they can share. Wesley was on the couch, reading the same book he'd told my grandmother about at the Christmas table. My mother stopped beside him on her way to the kitchen and asked what it was. He told her. She said she'd read it once, years ago. And did he want to know what she remembered about it? He said yes. They talked about it for a few minutes. It was not a large thing, but it was real, and it was theirs, and it was new. She stayed for dinner that evening. She stayed for New Year's. By the time February arrived, her plants were on my windowsill, 3 of them in a row, a fern and a small jade, and the rosemary from Christmas that was still, improbably, alive. Wesley asked me one evening in January, while we were washing dishes together, his question-asking time, the reliable slot he's found for the harder inquiries, why I hadn't said something sooner, why I'd let it go on for so long. I turned it over for a moment. Then I said, because some things need to be said at the right time, in the right place, by the right person. Not every moment is the moment. He thought about that. He washed a bowl and set it in the drying rack. Then he said, like when you let a fire get big enough to actually warm the whole room instead of just a corner. I said, yes, exactly like that. He nodded and reached for another bowl, and that was the end of the conversation. That's how he is. He asks the question, he gets the answer, he sits with it. He doesn't need to keep pulling at it. I find this extraordinary in an 11-year-old. I suspect he gets it from Neil. My grandmother and I still have our Tuesdays. Coffee, black, no sugar, from the corner place on 5th. 90 minutes of whatever she wants to talk about, which is usually something she's read, something she's remembered, something she thinks I should know. She is 84 years old, and she reads more than most people I know, and she retains more than most people I know, and she has not, as far as I can tell, slowed down in any meaningful way. The wooden box is still on her bedside table. I noticed, the first Tuesday of the new year, that there was no lock in the hasp. I asked her about it. She said, "Don't need the lock anymore. The right people know now." She said it the way she says most things, simply, finally, without elaboration. I drove home from that Tuesday thinking about what she had done, not just at the Christmas table, but over 5 years. The patience of it, the care of it, the fact that she had watched and waited and prepared and said nothing until the moment when saying something would actually count. 35 years in a law office will do that to a person, will teach you that the document matters more than the argument, that timing matters more than outrage, that the most powerful thing you can do is often to have everything in order before the other side knows there's going to be an order. I think about that Christmas table more than I expected to, about what it means to be placed at the wrong end of your own life, to have your children handed plastic cups in a house your money built, to be introduced as a function, she just dropped something off, in a room where you are, by every legal measure, the person with the most right to be standing. And I think about what it means that none of that was the end of the story. The thing about quiet strength, the real kind, not the performed kind, is that it doesn't announce itself when it's working. It pays the mortgage on the first of the month. It shows up on Tuesdays with coffee. It signs documents carefully and keeps copies of everything and wears the key around its neck every day until the day it finally, unhurriedly, takes it off. If you've ever sat at the wrong end of your own table, if you've ever been handed the paper cup while someone else got the crystal glass, in your own home, in your own family, I want you to know something. Someone sees it. Even when it feels like no one does, someone is watching. Someone has been keeping track. And sometimes the person keeping track is the quietest one in the room, sitting at the head of the table with a wooden box and a key, and 35 years of knowing exactly how these things work. Drop a comment below. Tell me if this hit close to home. Tell me about a time you had to wait for the right moment, and whether it finally came. I read every comment, and if you know someone who needs to hear today that being overlooked is not the same as being without power, send this to them. They'll know why you did. If you're new here, welcome. Subscribe so you don't miss what we put out next. This is the kind of story we tell in this space.